30 years ago, a mentor of mine, a retired logistics colonel, told me something I never forgot. He said, "The side that wins the last battle is rarely the side with the best soldiers. It is almost always the side with the last truck." I did not fully understand what he meant until 5 days ago. What happened in the Middle East this past week was not a battle. There were no dramatic last stands, no defining moments of courage under fire that will be written into military history. What happened was quieter, colder, and in many ways more devastating than any of that. It was the systematic, surgical dismantling of an army's ability to exist, not by destroying its soldiers, but by destroying everything those soldiers depend on to survive, move, and fight. And it was completed in 5 days. If you have been watching the headlines and feeling like something important is being left unsaid, you are right. Stay with me through this breakdown. Share this with anyone trying to understand what is actually happening. And if this kind of rigorous, ground-level analysis is what you have been looking for, hit like now. It helps this reach the people who need it most. Let me give you the number that matters before anything else. 120,000. That is the number of Israeli soldiers currently sitting in active deployment across 5 operational fronts. And as of day 5 of Iran's interdiction campaign, every single one of those soldiers was operating on a supply chain that had been severed at 90% of its nodes simultaneously. Fuel running out, ammunition reserves exhausted across multiple units, forward ration supplies consumed beyond the emergency reserve threshold, medical facilities operating at reduced capacity because the surgical consumables had not arrived, and no credible resupply pathway, by sea, by road, or by air, that was not either destroyed or actively threatened.
That is not a battlefield setback. That is a structural verdict. And understanding how it was delivered, how it was possible, and what it means for everyone watching from Tokyo to Washington to Taipei, that is what the next 40 minutes is going to give you. Here is the question I want you to hold in your mind as we go through this. How does a military force backed by the most powerful nation on earth, equipped with the most sophisticated weapon systems ever fielded, find itself operationally paralyzed in 5 days without a single decisive engagement? No Stalingrad, no Midway, no climactic confrontation, just silence, and empty fuel tanks, and soldiers waiting for orders that cannot be executed because the machine that makes modern warfare possible has stopped working. Hold that question. We are going to answer it completely. The architecture of Iran's supply interdiction campaign was not improvised. It was the output of years of systematic intelligence collection, target development, and operational rehearsal, a plan built around one core insight that Western military planners consistently underestimated. You do not destroy a modern army by defeating it in the field. You destroy it by making it impossible for the army to sustain itself in the field. And in a system built on interdependence, where every node depends on every other node, simultaneous attack across all nodes simultaneously does not degrade the system. It collapses it. The campaign unfolded in 5 distinct phases, each targeting a different layer of the IDF logistics architecture in a sequence specifically designed so that the destruction of each layer prevented the surviving layers from compensating. Phase 1 began at 2:40 in the morning on day 1. 34 precision strikes against Israel's primary military import terminal at Ashdod. The targeting was not random. Every container crane serving the military cargo terminal was struck individually. The fuel offloading pier was destroyed in a sequencing pattern calculated to produce complete structural collapse rather than repairable damage. The bonded military warehouse complex received penetrating warhead impacts designed to achieve internal detonation of stored munitions rather than simply disabling the external structure. Haifa, the northern port serving as the primary logistics gateway for forces on the northern front, absorbed 41 strikes focused on its military fuel terminal and the rail connection linking it to the forward logistics base network. The Red Sea port, Israel's only non-Mediterranean maritime import pathway,
was struck by 18 weapons that destroyed its container handling infrastructure and severed its road and rail connections. In 6 hours, 90% of Israel's maritime import capacity was gone. And here is what made this phase so operationally decisive in a way that goes beyond the obvious destruction. A modern army at war does not live on what it has already stockpiled. It lives on what is continuously arriving. The IDF's forward operational posture assumes a supply chain that is always flowing, always replenishing the fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts that combat operations consume at rates that no static stockpile can cover indefinitely. Phase 1 did not just destroy a port, it cut the artery. Everything that followed was the body bleeding out from that first cut. Phase 2 targeted the overland network. 12 major road bridge crossings on the primary logistics routes between Israel's central stockpile complex and its northern and southern operational fronts were struck by precision weapons, achieving structural collapse at the bridge deck level. Not damage requiring repair, destruction requiring complete reconstruction. Rail lines serving the northern logistics corridor were struck at 9 separate points, each chosen to maximize the length of track rendered unusable by a single impact. The targeting logic here is worth pausing on. Iran's planners did not attack vehicles on the road, a tactic that is operationally expensive and produces only temporary disruption. They attacked the infrastructure the vehicles must use. A destroyed bridge cannot be bypassed when every bridge on every alternate route has also been destroyed. Phase 3 went after the forward logistics depots, the hardened, dispersed stockpile facilities that represent the IDF's organic supply buffer. The fact that Iranian targeting databases contained accurate location data for the majority of these facilities is itself an intelligence finding, whose implications extend far beyond the immediate tactical situation. 11 of Israel's 14 identified forward depots were struck. The 3 that survived were located within urban areas where collateral damage constraints limited the strike package, a constraint that Iran's planners appear to have deliberately incorporated into their targeting. The surviving depot inventory represented between 3 and 7 days of supply at current consumption rates. Enough to last until the next phase of the campaign made that supply irrelevant. Phase 4 addressed the air logistics pathway, the emergency resupply mechanism that American and Israeli contingency planners had identified as the primary compensating option if maritime and overland routes were severed. Ben Gurion International Airport's runways were struck at 6 separate points, with penetrating warheads producing subsurface detonations, craters specifically engineered to resist emergency repair. Ramon Airport in the south was struck simultaneously. Military airfields with adequate cargo runway capacity had already been rendered non-operational in earlier strikes. By the end of Phase 4, Israel had no functional air cargo terminal capable of receiving the heavy-lift aircraft that emergency military resupply requires. The airbridge that Washington needed did not exist. Phase 5 was not a discrete event. It was a sustained enforcement campaign. When Israeli engineering units attempted emergency bridge repair on 2 of the destroyed road crossings, follow-on strikes destroyed the repair equipment and the partially completed work. When commercial vessels attempted to approach Ashdod under improvised transfer arrangements, the approach was made clearly non-viable. The message of Phase 5 was consistent and unambiguous. The interdiction was not a one-time event. It was a sustained operational condition that would be maintained until the strategic objectives that motivated it were achieved. Now let us talk about the arithmetic. Because the arithmetic is where the abstract becomes real, in a way that no amount of battlefield narrative can match. An IDF armored brigade in active operations consumes approximately 180,000 liters of diesel fuel per day across all its organic vehicles. Israel currently has approximately 8 armored brigades deployed in operational configurations. At that consumption rate, the surviving fuel inventory after the port strikes and depot destruction represented between 4 and 6 days of operational consumption. By day 5, armored vehicles were being immobilized not by enemy action, but by empty tanks. Aviation fuel presents an even more acute constraint. IDF air operations at current sortie rates consume approximately 2.4 million liters of aviation fuel daily. By day 5, sortie rates had been reduced by over 60% as fuel conservation protocols were implemented. The F-35s that Israel depends on for deep strike missions were being flown at a fraction of their operational tempo, their sorties rationed against a supply that was visibly counting down. Ammunition arithmetic is equally unforgiving. An Israeli artillery battalion firing at standard sustained rates expends approximately 800 rounds per day. Multiply that across all deployed artillery systems, add tank main gun ammunition, anti-tank missiles, and precision-guided munitions, and the daily consumption figure runs to thousands of tons. By day 5, multiple artillery units had reported exhaustion of available stocks and cessation of fire missions. Food for 120,000 personnel requires approximately 360 tons delivered daily. IDF doctrine calls for forward units to carry 3 days of organic ration supply. By day 4, units in the most forward positions were consuming emergency reserves intended for last resort situations. By day 5, operational assessments included language that no military commander ever wants to write. Personnel combat effectiveness degraded by nutritional insufficiency. This is the moment I want you to really sit with, because this is where the story shifts from logistics to human experience. Soldiers do not break when they run out of supplies. They break when they stop believing the supplies are coming. The physical reality of empty crates and dry fuel tanks is survivable if the soldier in that forward position believes that the system backing them up is functioning, that the resupply is delayed, not destroyed. When that belief goes, the organizational coherence that sustains military performance begins to dissolve. By day 5 of this campaign, the soldiers holding those positions had access to the same information we are discussing now. They knew the ports were destroyed. They knew the roads were impassable. They knew the airfields were cratered. That knowledge does not produce determination. It produces a different kind of calculation entirely. The United States could not execute the emergency resupply that Israel required. And I want to state this as plainly as I can because the coverage has consistently softened it. This was not a failure of political will. It was a failure of operational physics. American C-17 heavy-lift aircraft carry approximately 75 tons per sortie. Israel's aviation fuel requirement alone, 2.4 million liters daily, translates to approximately 2,000 tons that must arrive every single day just to maintain reduced sortie rates. That fuel requirement alone demands 27 heavy-lift sorties daily before a single round of ammunition or kilogram of food has been loaded. The entire available C-17 fleet cannot meet that throughput, and that is before confronting the second problem. The runways those aircraft need to land on no longer exist. And the third problem, the threat environment that makes flying large, slow, radar-visible cargo aircraft into that airspace without fighter escort not a survivable operational option. The circular dependency here is complete. Functional bases are required to escort cargo aircraft. The bases are destroyed. There is no quick resolution to that loop. What Iran demonstrated in these 5 days was not just military capability. It was the product of 50 years of sanctions pressure, targeted assassinations, industrial sabotage, and continuous military threat. Pressures specifically designed to break an institution that instead produced an institution with a deeply internalized conviction that external pressure is a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be accepted. That conviction, expressed operationally as the willingness to execute complex, sustained, high-risk campaigns against heavily defended targets, is what made this possible. This campaign required no external permission, no congressional authorization, no export license, no allied political consensus. It required weapons Iran built, targeting data Iran's intelligence services developed, and operational doctrine Iran's planners created. When it was complete, Iran needed nothing from outside. Israel needed everything and could receive none of it. In Moscow, this outcome is being absorbed as confirmation that a carefully calibrated strategic investment has matured. The weapons transfers, the electronic warfare cooperation, the satellite navigation support,
all provided with precise threshold management designed to produce strategic returns without triggering direct American military retaliation. In Beijing, the focus is on the precedent. An army equipped by the most powerful nation on Earth was operationally paralyzed in 5 days before any resupply pathway could be established. The strategic implications of that precedent for any theater where American logistics dependency is a factor, including the Taiwan Strait, are being integrated into planning processes right now. For the broader international community, for the nations of Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Latin America that have spent decades navigating the constraints of American-dominated international order, the past 5 days have provided a reference point of extraordinary strategic significance. The army that Washington armed, trained, and presented as the demonstration of what American-backed military power looks like has been operationally paralyzed by a sanctioned regional power without a single conventional battlefield engagement. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global oil trade and 3 million barrels per day of liquefied natural gas pass, sits within the same operational reach as the supply routes that just stopped feeding 120,000 soldiers. Every energy importing economy on Earth is now pricing that reality into its strategic calculations in ways it was not 5 days ago. Here is where I want to give you my assessment, and I am going to be direct about it because I think you deserve directness over diplomatic hedging. What happened in these 5 days is not a battle that went badly for one side within an ongoing strategic contest. It is the operational proof of a structural transition that has been accumulating for 2 decades, and that the Western foreign policy establishment consistently declined to acknowledge because acknowledgement would have required revising the foundational assumptions of its entire strategic architecture. This is not a turning point within the existing order. It is evidence that the existing order has already turned. The IDF did not lose this on the front line. It lost it in the ports, on the bridges, in the depots, in the airfields, in the invisible architecture of supply and sustainment that modern military power depends on completely, and that Israel's leadership had assumed was protected by an American guarantee that has now been empirically tested against a sophisticated adversary and found to have limits. Hard operational limits, not political limits, physics limits. 120,000 soldiers are still in those positions. The supply routes are still severed. The ports are still not functional. And Iran still holds the operational initiative. The question I want to leave you with is not about what happened. That has been laid out in full. The question is what comes next. Does Iran strike again to convert operational paralysis into strategic collapse? Or does it hold its position and let the logistics arithmetic complete its own work? Can Washington construct an emergency resupply corridor through a threat environment specifically engineered to defeat one? And what does the answer to that question mean for every other security architecture built on the same assumption of American logistical reliability? Leave your analysis in the comments. Tell me which scenario you think is most likely and why. I read every response and I respond to the ones that advance the analysis. Your perspective matters to this conversation. If this breakdown gave you the depth that the headlines are not providing, share it with one person who is genuinely trying to understand this conflict. Hit like. It takes 1 second and it puts this analysis in front of people who need it. And if you are not already here daily for this level of strategic analysis, this is the moment to subscribe. No noise, no agenda, just the operational truth of what is actually happening, updated every day as it develops.